Elara lived a life painted in muted tones, a quiet existence often overlooked, much like the gentle hum of distant traffic that was always present but rarely truly heard. She wasn't one to command a room or even draw a second glance. Her days unfolded in a predictable rhythm, tending to her small apartment, working part-time at the local library, a haven of hushed whispers and comforting scents of aged paper, and, most importantly, spending every possible moment with Buster. Buster wasn't just a dog. He was the vibrant splash of color in Elara's otherwise understated world, a creature of indeterminate breed. He possessed the charmingly chaotic features of a dozen different dogs rolled into one, a scruffy terrier coat, the soulful eyes of a basset hound, and ears that flopped at incongruous angles depending on his mood. He was a rescue. Found years ago huddled by a dumpster, a shivering bundle of matted fur and skeletal ribs. Elara, then barely out of her own turbulent teenage years, had poured every ounce of her fledgling compassion into him. In return, Buster had given her unconditional love, a loyalty so profound it bordered on the spiritual. He was her shadow, her confidant, her only true family. In a world that had often been harsh and indifferent, Buster was her constant, unwavering anchor. When the quiet of her apartment became too loud with unspoken anxieties, Buster would nudge her hand with his wet nose, his big eyes seeming to understand. When she felt the familiar sting of invisibility in a crowd, his warm, furry presence beside her was a comforting reminder that she was, at least to him, the center of the universe. Their routine was simple, bordering on sacred. Mornings began with Buster's enthusiastic, tail-thumping greetings, followed by a shared breakfast, a plain oatmeal for Elara, a meticulously portioned kibble for Buster, sometimes with a special sprinkle of cheese if it had been a particularly draining week at the library. Then came their daily walk, not just a quick stroll around the block, but an exploration of their small town's pockets of green, the quiet stretch along the river, the winding paths of the community garden, and their favorite, the sprawling, somewhat unkempt local park. The park was their sanctuary. It was here that Elara would often shed the invisible cloak of her timidity, letting out soft laughter as Buster chased squirrels with unbridled glee or dug imaginary treasures near the old oak tree. She would sit on a weathered bench, a book usually forgotten in her lap, watching Buster bound through the tall grass, his scruffy tail wagging a joyful rhythm. It was in these moments that Elara felt truly free, truly seen, truly herself. Buster didn't judge her quietness or her anxieties. He simply loved her, fiercely and without reservation. He was her reminder that even in the most ordinary lives, extraordinary love could exist. One crisp autumn afternoon, the air was unusually still, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. Elara, bundled in a worn but cozy sweater, smiled as Buster trotted ahead, his nose twitching, investigating every interesting smell. They were deep within the park, far from the paved paths, near a cluster of old growth trees that offered a sense of secluded peace. Buster, ever the adventurer, darted into a thicket of bushes, his tail a blur of excitement. Elara chuckled, calling out softly, "Buster, don't get lost. Silly boy." She waited, enjoying the quiet solitude. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves above, and for a fleeting moment, everything felt right with the world. Then, a sharp guttural yelp pierced the tranquility, followed by a chorus of harsh laughter. It wasn't Buster's playful yip. It was a sound of pure pain, of terror. Elara's blood ran cold. Her heart leaped into her throat, a frantic drum against her ribs. She scrambled to her feet, her gaze sweeping frantically towards the sound, through a gap in the foliage. She saw them, 3 figures, teenagers, standing over something small and struggling on the ground. And then she saw Buster. He was whimpering, trying to scramble away, but one of the boys had his foot on Buster's back. Pressing down, another, taller, and with a sneer plastered across his face, lifted his leg. Time seemed to warp, slowing to an agonizing crawl. Elara saw the arc of the boy's foot, the sickening thud as it connected with Buster's side. A louder, more desperate yelp tore from Buster, a sound that ripped through Elara's very soul. He crumpled, a small, pathetic heap on the dry leaves. The boys laughed again, a sound devoid of humanity, full of a chilling casual cruelty. The sneering boy, Blake. She vaguely registered his face from local gossip. Son of the powerful Mr. Harrison. He kicked Buster again, a dismissive flick of his shoe, as if the dog were nothing more than a stone in his path. Elara stood frozen. Her mind screamed, but her body wouldn't obey. Terror, cold and sharp, seized her. Disbelief warred with a primal horror. This couldn't be happening. Not to Buster. Not to her sweet, loyal Buster. Her hands trembled, icy cold despite the mild autumn air. Her breath hitched in her throat. She wanted to scream, to run, to protect him. But she was paralyzed by a fear so profound it rendered her mute and motionless. Then, one of the boys spotted her. "Hey, look, it's the dog's owner," he jeered, pointing. Blake turned, his eyes locking onto Elara's, a look of contemptuous amusement on his face. He said something, but the words were lost in the buzzing roar in Elara's ears. A hot, unfamiliar sensation began to build within Elara, deep in her gut, slowly spreading like a wildfire. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was a searing wave of fury, an emotion so potent it surprised her. How dare they? How dare they hurt Buster? How dare they treat another living being with such callous disregard? The boys started to walk away, laughing, their cruel act already forgotten. Blake gave one last contemptuous glance at the whimpering Buster on the ground before he disappeared behind the trees. Elara finally broke free of her paralysis. She stumbled forward, scrambling over fallen branches, her gaze fixed on Buster. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering, afraid to touch him, afraid of what she might find. Buster whimpered again, his body trembling, his eyes clouded with pain and fear. He tried to lift his head, but it fell back weakly. Tears, hot and stinging, welled in Elara's eyes, blurring her vision. They weren't just tears of sorrow, but of an incandescent rage she had never known she possessed. She gently, carefully, gathered Buster into her arms. He was heavier than usual, a dead weight, and she could feel his heart thumping erratically against her chest as she clutched him close. A silent vow formed in her mind, a stark contrast to her usual quiet humility. They had kicked Buster. They had done it right in front of her, mocking her, dismissing Buster's very existence. But something had snapped inside Elara. The quiet, unassuming woman was gone, replaced by a nascent strength, a steel she never knew she possessed, a spark, small but fiercely burning, ignited in her soul. This would not stand. Not this time. She would do something. Something no one expected. The world outside the thicket of bushes seemed to tilt on its axis. The vibrant colors of autumn leaves, moments ago a comforting tapestry, now seemed too bright, too jarring against the stark reality of what had just happened. Elara's every nerve ending was screaming, a symphony of terror and burgeoning rage. She clutched Buster to her chest, his small body heavy and limp, his whimpers echoing the frantic beat of her own heart. The warmth of his fur was usually a source of comfort, but now it felt too still, too fragile. She rose unsteadily, her legs feeling like jelly. Each step was a battle, a desperate race against time and an invisible enemy that still felt too close. The laughter of Blake and his friends, though fading, seemed to reverberate in her ears, a mocking echo that fueled the desperate urgency in her movements. She had to get Buster help. Now, the small veterinary clinic was a blur of efficiency and quiet competence. Dr. Aries, a kind-faced woman with perpetually tired eyes, took Buster from Alara's trembling arms with a calm professionalism that was both reassuring and terrifying. Ilara watched through the glass partition as Dr. Aris gently examined Buster, her brows furrowed in concern. The moments stretched into an eternity. Ilara paced the small waiting room, her mind replaying the sickening thud of the kick, the piercing yelp, Blake's sneering face. Each replay ignited a fresh wave of nausea and a burning, unfamiliar anger. Finally, Dr. Aris emerged, a somber expression on her face. "He's going to be okay, Ilara," she said, her voice soft but firm. "He has some pretty severe internal bruising, likely from blunt force trauma. No broken bones, thankfully, but it's going to be painful for a while. We'll keep him overnight for observation and pain management." Ilara sagged against the wall, a tidal wave of relief washing over her, immediately followed by the resurgence of fury. "Internal bruising," she whispered, the words barely audible. They really hurt him." Dr. Aris nodded, her eyes meeting Ilara's with understanding. "It was a deliberate, cruel act. Ilara, we see too much of it." Her gaze lingered on Ilara's face, seeing not just the pain, but the raw, simmering anger beneath. "Do you know who did this?" Ilara nodded, a grim set to her jaw. Blake Harrison, and his friends." Dr. Aris's expression hardened. "Ah, Harrison. That explains the precision of the cruelty." There was a bitterness in her tone that Ilara hadn't expected. "Mr. Harrison's son. Not the first time his little pranks have caused harm, but animal abuse, that's a new low, even for him." Ilara spent the rest of the evening at Buster's side, stroking his scruffy fur, whispering reassurances. He was still groggy from the medication, but his eyes, when he opened them, were full of a gentle trust that broke and mended Ilara's heart simultaneously. How could anyone hurt something so pure, so trusting, as she sat there? The quiet hum of the clinic around her. Ilara's initial shock began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. This wasn't just about Buster's physical pain. It was about the casual cruelty, the sense of impunity with which Blake had acted. It was about the injustice. Ilara had always been a quiet person, prone to retreating rather than confronting. Her life had taught her to accept things as they were, to avoid conflict, to simply endure. She had seen injustice before, small, everyday slights, moments of unfairness at work, instances where powerful people trampled over the less fortunate. She had always sighed, offered a silent prayer, and moved on. But this was different. This was Buster. This was a direct assault on the one innocent, pure thing in her life. A memory flashed through her mind, the time in high school when a popular girl had stolen her carefully crafted science project, claiming it as her own. And Ilara, too timid to speak up, had let it happen or the countless times at the library when rude patrons had dismissed her, spoken down to her, and she had just quietly endured it. All those instances of quiet acceptance, of swallowing her voice, coalesced into a bitter taste in her mouth. This time, she wouldn't swallow it. A fierce, protective instinct she hadn't known she possessed welled up within her. It was a foreign sensation, exhilarating and terrifying all at once. Her hands, which had been trembling with fear, now curled into tight fists. A quiet but fierce resolve began to form, a steel thread weaving itself through the soft fabric of her usual demeanor. She wouldn't let this go unpunished. It wasn't just about Buster. It was about every time she'd been stepped on, every injustice she'd witnessed and silently condoned. Blake Harrison, and by extension, his father's arrogant world, needed a reckoning. She thought of Buster's trusting eyes, his soft whimper as he lay on the ground. A wave of profound sadness washed over her, quickly followed by a cold, burning determination. This was a line that had been crossed. The quiet, timid Ilara was still there, but beneath the surface, something new had been awakened, a dormant strength, forged in the crucible of love and betrayal. She pulled out her phone, her fingers still shaking slightly. She opened a blank note, and slowly, painstakingly, she began to type, "Incident report assault on Buster. Date October 26th. Location Willow Creek Park, near the old oak trees. Perpetrator Blake Harrison, son of Arthur Harrison. 2 other unidentified males. Witness Ilara Vance." She detailed the events as clearly as she could, forcing herself to relive the horror, because to forget was to allow it to be diminished, to allow it to be just another unspoken injustice. The quiet library assistant, the woman who preferred the company of books to people, was beginning a new chapter, and this one would not be quiet. The next morning, Buster was still sore, but much brighter. Ilara brought him home, settling him onto his favorite cushion. He licked her hand, a soft, reassuring gesture, and Ilara felt her resolve solidify. She looked at the small bandage on his side, a stark reminder of the cruelty. She knew, with chilling certainty, that this would not be easy. The Harrisons were powerful in this town. Arthur Harrison, Blake's father, owned most of the prime real estate, controlled local politics through donations and influence, and had a reputation for crushing anyone who stood in his way. People feared him, and by extension, feared his arrogant son. But fear, Ilara realized, no longer held the absolute dominion it once did over her. The fear of Blake, of Mr. Harrison, of the consequences of speaking up, it was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a far greater fear, the fear of doing nothing. The fear of letting Buster's suffering be in vain. The fear of letting injustice prevail. Once again, as Buster drifted off to sleep, curled contentedly on his cushion, Ilara went to her small kitchen table. She pulled out a fresh notepad and a pen. Her hands were steady now. She had a new purpose. The world had just kicked her dog in front of her. Now, she was going to do something no one expected, and it would start with understanding the enemy. She began to write down everything she knew, everything she could recall about the Harrisons. The quiet woman had found her voice, not in a shout, but in a determined whisper of a plan. The following morning, a thin, persistent drizzle coated the town, mirroring the lingering gloom in Ilara's heart. Buster, though home, was clearly still in pain. He moved stiffly, a low whimper escaping him whenever he shifted. And his eyes, usually bright with mischief, were dull. Alara felt each of his small discomforts as a sharp ache in her own chest. The vet had been clear rest, pain medication, and time, but time felt like a luxury Alara couldn't afford. The image of Blake's sneering face, the casual cruelty of his kick, replayed endlessly in her mind, a venomous loop. She administered Buster's medication with a gentle hand, then settled beside him on the sofa, stroking his fur. He leaned into her touch, a small gesture that solidified her resolve. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about preventing this from happening again. To Buster, or to any other vulnerable creature, it was about proving that even the powerful couldn't act with absolute impunity. Her initial attempt at seeking justice through official channels began that afternoon, with Buster nestled safely on his cushion. Alara gathered her courage, her notes, and the vet's report. The police station was a drab, utilitarian building, filled with the scent of stale coffee and disinfectant. She approached the front desk, her voice a little shaky as she explained her purpose. A young officer, Officer Miller, was assigned to take her statement. He was polite enough, but his eyes held a subtle weariness, a hint of dismissal, even before she began. Alara recounted the incident, her voice gaining strength as she described the brutality of the kick. Buster's cries, Blake's contemptuous laughter. She presented the vet's report, its clinical language starkly outlining Buster's injuries. Officer Miller listened, nodding occasionally, scribbling notes on a pad. When she finished, a heavy silence filled the small interview room. He cleared his throat. Ms. Vance, I understand this is upsetting. It's a shame what happened to your dog. A shame, Alara's voice, usually so soft, had an edge to it. He was violently assaulted. This was not a shame, it was a crime. By Blake Harrison. Officer Miller sighed, leaning back in his chair. Look, Ms. Vance, we know the Harrison boy. And yes, he can be boisterous. But this is a he said, she said situation. You say he kicked your dog. He'll deny it. There were no other witnesses. Correct. There were his friends, Alara countered, her frustration building. They were laughing. They saw it. And they'll back him up, Miller said, shrugging slightly. Their word against yours. And frankly, Ms. Vance, it's a dog. We've got bigger fish to fry. Burglaries, assaults, drug issues, animal complaints, especially without clear, corroborating evidence or serious injury, often don't go far, especially when it involves someone like young Mr. Harrison. The implication hung heavy in the air, especially when it involves someone whose father practically owns this town. Alara felt a familiar wave of helplessness wash over her. She knew, intellectually, what he was getting at. The Harrisons were untouchable. Their influence permeated every corner of this town, from the mayor's office to, it seemed, the police department. But the vet's report proves he was injured, Alara pressed, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. It's documented proof of harm. It proves your dog was injured. Yes, Officer Miller conceded, but it doesn't definitively prove how it was injured or who did it. Beyond your word, accidents happen. Dogs get into fights. His tone was subtly dismissive, subtly suggesting she was overreacting. My advice, Ms. Vance, is to focus on your dog's recovery. Let sleeping dogs lie, so to speak. He even managed a small, sympathetic smile. Entirely missing the irony of his words, Alara stared at him, a profound sense of disappointment and anger settling in her chest. She had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that the law would offer some recourse, some form of justice. But the system, it seemed, was as rigged as she had always suspected. Her stomach churned with a mix of nausea and renewed determination. If the police wouldn't help, she would have to find another way. She left the station feeling deflated, yet also strangely invigorated. The dismissal, the subtle condescension, the blatant protection of the powerful, it all fueled the fire that had ignited within her. She walked home through the persistent drizzle, the cold rain a stark contrast to the burning resolve in her gut. She would not let this go. Not now. Not ever. Back in her apartment, Buster lifted his head, whimpering softly as Alara entered. She knelt beside him, stroking his fur, her eyes full of a new, steely glint. "It's okay, boy," she murmured. "They won't help us, so we'll help ourselves." She pulled out her notebook, the one where she had started jotting down observations about Blake. Now. She added a new heading, "The Harrison Problem." She started with what she knew about Arthur Harrison, Blake's father. He was a ruthless real estate developer. His company, Harrison Holdings, had systematically bought up large swathes of the town, replacing old charming buildings with soulless commercial complexes. He was known for his aggressive tactics, his ability to push through zoning changes, and his uncanny knack for acquiring properties from reluctant sellers. Whispers often followed his name, of underhanded dealings, of unfortunate accidents befalling those who stood in his way, of people mysteriously giving up their long-held family homes for a fraction of their worth. Alara had always heard these rumors, dismissed them as local gossip. She was too focused on her own quiet life, her own struggles, to delve into the murky world of town politics and powerful businessmen. But now, it was personal. Blake's cruelty was a direct reflection of his father's ethos, a casual disregard for anything or anyone perceived as weak or inconvenient. She opened her laptop, something she rarely used for anything beyond checking library circulation records. She began with simple searches: Arthur Harrison, Harrison Holdings, Willow Creek Development. A digital rabbit hole opened before her. News articles, dry legal documents, planning commission meeting minutes. It was overwhelming, a dense thicket of information. But Alara felt a strange sense of purpose. She learned about the Willow Creek Gateway Project, Harrison Holdings' latest, most ambitious undertaking. It was a massive luxury housing and shopping complex slated for the northern edge of town. And the location clicked with a chilling realization: it bordered directly on the beloved Willow Creek Park, their park, where Buster had been attacked. Not just bordered, the plans indicated a significant portion of the park itself would be absorbed, along with a cluster of quaint, older homes that had stood for generations. A memory surfaced, unbidden, from a library patron, old Mr. Henderson, a man with wispy white hair and a perpetually worried frown. He had been looking for old maps of the town recently, muttering something about them trying to push us out. Alara remembered his distress, but had simply offered a sympathetic nod. Now, it made terrible sense. Mr. Henderson lived in one of those older homes, directly in the path of Harrison's Gateway Project. The pieces began to fall into place, forming a disturbing mosaic. Blake's arrogant sense of entitlement, his willingness to inflict pain without consequence, was not an isolated incident. It was a microcosm of his father's empire, an empire built on the casual destruction of anything that stood in the way of profit, whether it was old homes, a beloved park, or an innocent dog. Alara's focus narrowed. This wasn't just about Buster anymore. It was about the park, the homes, the lives of people like Mr. Henderson. It was about exposing the rot at the heart of the Harrison family's power. If she could tie Blake's violent nature to his father's ruthless business practices, if she could expose the full extent of their disregard for the community, then perhaps, just perhaps, she could force justice to be done. The seed of resolve had sprouted into a thorny, determined bush. She knew it was a colossal task. She was just Alara Vance, a quiet librarian, an invisible woman. They were the powerful Harrisons, seemingly untouchable. But they had made a grave mistake. They had kicked her dog. They had provoked someone who had nothing left to lose but the quiet dignity of her existence, and everything to gain by fighting for what was right. She spent the rest of the day hunched over her laptop, meticulously sifting through data, cross-referencing names, dates, and property records. Her eyes burned, but her mind was clearer than it had been in years. The world she had always observed from a safe distance was now demanding her active participation. She was no longer a bystander. She was a quiet, unassuming force, beginning to push back against a seemingly immovable object. The Goliath in this story had just awakened a David, and this David had a very loyal, very injured companion to avenge. Unbeknownst to Alara, her quiet ordeal in the park and her subsequent desperate rush to the vet had not gone entirely unobserved. Tucked away on a bench, shaded by a sprawling chestnut tree that offered both seclusion and a clear vantage point, sat Mrs. Albright. Her appearance was deceptively frail, a small, silver-haired woman in a sensible tweed coat, her hands clasped over a worn leather handbag. But beneath the surface of demure grandmotherliness lay a mind as sharp and incisive as a surgeon's scalpel. Honed over decades as an investigative journalist, Mrs. Albright had seen it all. Corruption, cover-ups, casual cruelties that would make lesser souls recoil. She had retired to Willow Creek seeking peace, but the reporter's instinct, once ignited, never truly dies. It merely lies dormant, awaiting a spark. And the sight of Blake Harrison, the town's resident spoiled menace, kicking an innocent dog, followed by the sight of the young woman cradling the whimpering animal with such raw, desperate tenderness, had been that spark. She recognized Blake immediately. His family's name, Arthur Harrison's name, was whispered with a mix of awe and resentment throughout Willow Creek. Mrs. Albright knew the type well, the kind of power that believed itself above reproach, above the law, above basic human decency. She had covered stories like this her entire career, the powerful trampling the powerless. But it was Alara who truly captivated her. The young woman's initial shock, the paralysis of fear, was heartbreakingly familiar. Mrs. Albright had seen that look in so many victims' eyes, yet, as Alara cradled her dog, and then slowly, with an almost imperceptible shift, straightened her shoulders, Mrs. Albright detected something else, a flicker of something fierce, a quiet indignation that belied Alara's unassuming demeanor. It was a spark of courage, of resolve, that resonated deeply with Mrs. Albright's own spirit. She had seen that spark in herself, in the mirror of her own youth, when she had decided to dedicate her life to chasing down truth from her vantage point. Mrs. Albright had watched Alara disappear with the injured dog. She had then seen the police cruiser arrive at the park gates a little while later, driven by Officer Miller, who had an unfortunate reputation for turning a blind eye when it suited the town's power brokers. She saw him speak briefly with Blake and his friends, a casual, almost chummy exchange before they sauntered off, laughing. Mrs. Albright's lips thinned into a grim line, just as she expected. Another instance of the Harrisons being above the fray over the next few days. Mrs. Albright kept a discreet watch on Alara's apartment building. She saw the young woman leave for the library, her shoulders still a bit hunched, but there was a new, subtle determination in her stride. She observed Alara at the library, quietly assisting patrons, but occasionally pausing, her gaze distant, lost in thought. Mrs. Albright knew that look, the look of someone formulating a plan. However nascent, one afternoon, Mrs. Albright spotted Alara entering the police station. She waited patiently, sipping lukewarm tea from a thermos. When Alara emerged, hours later, her posture was deflated, but the steel in her eyes was unmistakable. Mrs. Albright knew, without a doubt, that Alara had been dismissed, likely patronized, and her pleas for justice ignored. And she knew, with an even greater certainty, that this dismissal would not crush Alara, but rather forge her resolve. It was time. Mrs. Albright believed in letting people find their own strength, but sometimes a quiet push, a guiding hand, was needed. Alara was clearly a good soul, a brave one, but perhaps lacking the tools, the experience, to navigate the treacherous waters of local power. Mrs. Albright had those tools, those decades of experience. The following morning, Alara was at the local coffee shop, trying to make sense of the tangled web of Arthur Harrison's property acquisitions she had found online. The sheer volume of data was overwhelming, threatening to drown her fledgling determination. She pushed her glasses up her nose, frowning at a particularly convoluted zoning variance. "Excuse me, dear." A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. Alara looked up to see Mrs. Albright standing beside her table, a kindly smile on her face. "May I join you? This place is quite full." Alara, startled but accustomed to the quiet courtesies of strangers, nodded. "Of course." Mrs. Albright settled into the chair opposite her, placing her handbag neatly on the floor. "I'm Martha Albright," she said, her eyes twinkling. "And you must be Alara. If I'm not mistaken—" Alara blinked, surprised. "Yes, I am. How do you know my name?" "Oh, a small town, dear." Mrs. Albright waved a dismissive hand. "And I'm a regular at the library. I've often seen you there. You have such a pleasant demeanor." She paused, her gaze softening. "And I'm so very sorry about what happened to your lovely dog, Buster. Isn't it I saw it? You know, from the park bench." Alara felt a jolt of surprise. A witness. Someone who wasn't Blake's friend. You saw it." Mrs. Albright nodded gravely. "Every sickening moment. That young Harrison boy, Blake, is a menace, and his father, Arthur Harrison, is worse, a wolf in sheep's clothing, buying up half the town." Her eyes, surprisingly sharp, met Alara's. "I also saw you go into the police station, and I can guess how that went. Officer Miller has a habit of looking the other way when it comes to the Harrisons." A wave of relief, mixed with a renewed sense of validation, washed over Alara. Someone else knew. Someone else believed her. "They said it was just a dog," Alara whispered, the frustration raw in her voice. "They dismissed me, like I was making it up, like Buster's pain didn't matter." "Precisely," Mrs. Albright said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Because it suits them. Arthur Harrison has built his empire on stepping on whoever he needs to. His son's cruelty is merely a reflection of the father's ambition. He wants that park, and those little houses around it." She gestured subtly towards Alara's laptop screen, where the zoning maps glowed. He's been trying to push out the residents for months. Old Mr. Henderson, Mrs. Petrov, they're hanging on by a thread. Alara looked from the map to Mrs. Albright, her mind racing. I've been looking into that. The Willow Creek Gateway project. It's huge, and it takes over a big part of the park. And Mr. Henderson's house is right in the way. A faint smile touched Mrs. Albright's lips. Sharp girl. Most people don't bother to connect the dots. But I've been watching Harrison for years. He's always just on the edge of legality, always using intimidation, always finding loopholes. He's trying to get that park rezoned from public land to commercial. That requires public approval. Dear, and he's been greasing a lot of palms to make sure he gets it. Alara felt a surge of indignation. So, this isn't just about Buster anymore, is it? It's about everything. It's about how they treat everyone. Exactly, Mrs. Albright confirmed, her gaze unwavering. His son kicking your dog. That's just a symptom. The disease is deeper. It's about unchecked power, dear. And that, my young friend, is something I know a great deal about. She paused, then leaned forward, her voice low and serious. I used to be an investigative journalist. For 40 years, I chased down stories like this. Corruption, fraud, abuse of power. I know how to find the cracks in their armor. I know how to make them sweat. Alara stared, a mix of awe and trepidation in her eyes. This frail-looking woman, a retired journalist, possessed the very knowledge and experience she so desperately lacked. It was an unexpected, almost miraculous intervention. I saw something in you. Alara, Mrs. Albright continued, her voice gentle. When you picked up that poor dog, a quiet strength, a refusal to let evil stand. You have the heart for this fight. I have the mind. Together, we could do some real good. What do you say? Ready to turn that righteous anger into action? Ilara looked at her coffee, then back at Mrs. Albright's determined, kind eyes. It was a daunting proposition. She was just Ilara. But then she thought of Buster, whimpering in her arms, of Officer Miller's dismissive gaze, of the countless people Arthur Harrison must have trampled over. The quiet woman had finally found a voice, and now, an unlikely powerful ally, a slow, determined nod finally escaped her. Yes, she said, her voice stronger than she expected. Yes, Mrs. Albright, I'm ready. The coffee shop meeting marked a turning point for Alara. It was as if a dam had broken, releasing a torrent of pent-up frustration and illuminating a path forward. The sheer relief of having an ally, especially one as formidable as Mrs. Albright, was palpable. For the first time since Buster's attack, Alara felt a flicker of hope, not just for justice, but for herself. She wasn't alone anymore. First things first, Ilara, Mrs. Albright said, taking a sip of her now cold tea. You have to understand your adversary. Arthur Harrison isn't just rich. He's cunning. He operates in the gray areas, where laws bend but don't quite break, unless you know exactly where to look. They spent the next few days in a whirlwind of shared information and strategy. Mrs. Albright was a revelation. She moved with a quiet intensity, her mind a vast archive of journalistic techniques and insights into human nature. She taught Alara the art of observation, not just seeing, but noticing. Look for patterns, dear, habits, who they talk to, where they go, what they don't say. Their first objective was to build a comprehensive dossier on Arthur Harrison and Harrison Holdings. "The Public Records Office is your gold mine," Mrs. Albright instructed. "Property deeds, zoning applications, tax records, they're all public. But no one ever bothers to connect them." Ilara, with her librarian's meticulous nature, took to this task with surprising aptitude. She spent hours at the dusty town hall, poring over microfiches and oversized ledgers. The sheer volume of paper was daunting, but Mrs. Albright's guidance kept her focused. "Look for anomalies, Ilara, sudden changes in property ownership, especially around the park. Companies buying land and then dissolving, shell corporations." What Ilara uncovered was a dizzying web of transactions. Parcels of land around Willow Creek Park had been acquired through a series of complex deals involving multiple intermediary companies, some of which had been registered just months before the transactions and then quickly dissolved. Many of these companies trace back to P.O. boxes or obscure legal firms in other states, designed to obscure the true buyer. The ultimate beneficiary, however, was always Arthur Harrison. He's laundering the acquisitions through these shell companies. Mrs. Albright explained when Ilara presented her findings. It's a classic tactic to avoid direct scrutiny, inflate prices, or sometimes to hide the true source of funds. It also makes it harder for the original landowners to track who's really pushing them out. They focused on the homes bordering the park, particularly those owned by elderly residents. Ilara remembered Mr. Henderson and Mrs. Petrov. She looked up their addresses and found that Harrison Holdings had made multiple offers on their properties, escalating aggressively over time. She found records of conditional sales agreements that seemed to bind the residents but allowed Harrison to delay final purchase, essentially holding their properties hostage. "This is intimidation," Mrs. Albright stated, her voice tight with indignation. "He's banking on them getting desperate, or simply not having the energy to fight him. He knows they're old, probably relying on their property value for their retirement. He's squeezing them." Ilara felt a cold knot of anger tighten in her stomach. It was one thing to kick a dog. It was another to systematically dismantle the lives of an entire community for profit. The casual cruelty of Blake was simply a mirror of his father's calculated ruthlessness. Their investigation wasn't confined to dusty records. Mrs. Albright, with her years of experience, taught Ilara how to conduct discreet inquiries. They visited the affected residents, not as investigators, but as concerned neighbors, often with Buster, now significantly recovered and acting as a therapeutic presence, accompanying Ilara. "I just wanted to check on you, Mr. Henderson," Ilara would say, her voice gentle, holding Buster's leash. "I heard about the development plans. It must be very worrying." Mr. Henderson, a man whose shoulders seemed permanently slumped under the weight of his anxieties, brightened at the sight of Buster. "Oh, he's a fine dog. Yes, dear, it's very worrying. They keep sending letters, lowball offers, then threatening notes saying if I don't sell, the town will just condemn my property anyway for public good. They say I have no choice." His voice was tinged with despair. "They say I'll be left with nothing." Ilara and Mrs. Albright listened patiently, offering comfort and carefully guiding the conversation to elicit details. They learned that the residents were receiving confusing legal documents, often without proper explanation, urging them to sign away their rights. Many had been visited by aggressive real estate agents representing Harrison Holdings, who subtly implied that refusal would lead to their homes being forcibly taken with little compensation. They're preying on fear and confusion. Mrs. Albright whispered to Ilara after one such visit, "It's a common tactic. Overwhelm them with legalese, scare them with threats of eminent domain, and offer just enough to make them feel like they're getting something, even if it's a pittance compared to the true value. Alara started collecting copies of these letters and documents, creating a separate file for each resident. The evidence was mounting a clear pattern of coercion and unethical land acquisition. The injustice of it all burned hotter within her, a steady, unwavering flame. One afternoon, while Ilara was alone at the town hall, sifting through ancient zoning maps, she noticed a detail that made her heart pound. A small, almost imperceptible red ink circle on a map from 5 years ago, indicating a proposed sewage line extension. The line, according to the map, was meant to cut directly through a section of Willow Creek Park. However, a later map, signed off just 2 years ago, showed the line rerouted, curving sharply around the park's boundary. Why would a perfectly logical and direct route suddenly be changed to a far more expensive, circuitous one? It seemed illogical, unless the original route had been intended for something else entirely, something that would justify demolishing a section of the park. Ilara photocopied both maps, her hand trembling slightly. She felt like she was on the verge of uncovering something significant when she presented her findings to Mrs. Albright. The older woman's eyes lit up. "Brilliant." "Ilara," Mrs. Albright exclaimed, "this is exactly the kind of detail that exposes the true agenda. If the park was slated for demolition, they wouldn't want to run a sewage line through it, only to tear it up later. Rerouting it costs more money, takes more time, unless they knew the park wouldn't be public land for long." "So they plan to acquire the park even then?" Ilara asked, a cold realization dawning on her. "Precisely," Mrs. Albright confirmed. "This isn't a new development. Harrison has been eyeing that park for years, and the delay tactics, the constant offers to the residents, it's all part of a long game to wear them down and eventually get that land for a steal. The full scope of Arthur Harrison's ambition and his utter disregard for the community began to truly sink in. His son's act of cruelty in the park wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger, systemic problem of power and entitlement that had been festering in Willow Creek for years. It reinforced Alara's belief that what she was doing was right, necessary. But as their investigation deepened, a subtle shift occurred in their surroundings. Ilara began to notice things. A dark sedan, always parked a few blocks from her apartment, its windows tinted. A quick glimpse of a man with a stern face, wearing sunglasses, talking into a phone, just as she left the town hall. Small, unsettling details that raised the hairs on the back of her neck. Buster, too, seemed to sense the change. He became unusually alert, his ears swiveling constantly, his low growl a constant background hum whenever Ilara returned home or when a strange car idled outside. He would position himself protectively between Ilara and the door, his hackles slightly raised. His instincts, sharpened by his recent trauma, were telling him something was wrong. One evening, Ilara received an anonymous call. The voice was distorted, guttural, but the message was chillingly clear. "Drop it. Librarian, stick to your books. Some things are best left undisturbed." The line went dead. Ilara stood there, receiver in hand, her blood running cold. They knew. Harrison knew they were digging. She immediately called Mrs. Albright, her voice trembling as she recounted the call. "It means we're close." "Ilara," Mrs. Albright said, her voice calm and steady, but with an underlying edge of steel. "It means we're hitting a nerve. Good, they're rattling, which means we're effective, but it also means the stakes have just gone up. They're not playing nice anymore." Are you still with me? Elara looked down at Buster, who was now pressing himself against her leg, a low, rumbling growl emanating from his chest. She thought of Mr. Henderson, of Mrs. Petrov, of the park that was their sanctuary. And then she remembered the sickening thud of Blake's kick, Buster's yelp of pain. Her fear was still there, a cold, insidious presence, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was a fuel, mixed with anger and a fierce sense of justice. She clenched her jaw. Yes, Mrs. Albright, she said, her voice firm, resolute. More than ever, we have to stop them. The anonymous phone call had been a stark wake-up call. It was no longer a quiet investigation. It was a declared war, albeit one waged in the shadows. The Harrisons knew Elara and Mrs. Albright were digging, and they were sending a clear warning. This realization, however, didn't deter Elara. It solidified her resolve. The fear was still a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a burning indignation. They had underestimated her, and that was a mistake she intended to exploit. Mrs. Albright, ever the seasoned veteran, remained calm. They're trying to intimidate you, Elara. It's their first line of defense. They expect you to back down, to be a good little librarian and disappear. Don't give them the satisfaction. She then gave Elara a crash course in digital security and personal safety. Change your passwords. Be mindful of what you say on the phone. Vary your routines, and most importantly, always assume you're being watched. It sounds paranoid, but it's practical. Elara started implementing these changes immediately. She also began to carry a small, loud personal alarm in her purse. Buster, bless his instincts, became her unwitting sentinel. His low growl at unfamiliar sounds, his heightened alertness, served as a constant reminder to Elara to stay vigilant. Their bond, already unbreakable, deepened further under the shadow of this newfound threat. Their focus now shifted from merely gathering evidence to understanding the deeper layers of Arthur Harrison's scheme. Mrs. Albright theorized that Harrison's ambition went beyond just building a luxury complex. He's not just acquiring land for profit. Elara, she explained during one of their late-night planning sessions, hunched over cluttered maps and documents at Mrs. Albright's small, cozy apartment. He's also systematically trying to gain control of local governance. Zoning changes, building permits, environmental impact reports. All of it requires political sway. Elara, armed with Mrs. Albright's guidance, began researching the town council members, the planning commission, and even the mayor's financial disclosures. What she found was a subtle but pervasive pattern of donations from various consulting firms and investment groups with tenuous links back to Harrison Holdings. It was all perfectly legal on paper, carefully structured to avoid direct bribery. But the implications were clear. Harrison was buying influence. This is how he pushes through his projects. Elara, Mrs. Albright pointed out, tapping a pen against a donation record. He funds campaigns, offers consulting fees to retired officials, and then, when he needs a favorable vote, he calls in his markers. It's a network of obligation and veiled corruption. One particularly crucial piece of information Elara unearthed was a proposal for a major public infrastructure project, a new municipal water treatment facility. The proposed location was currently undeveloped wetlands on the far side of town, deemed ideal due to its natural filtration capabilities. However, Elara found an alternative proposal, quietly slipped into the Planning Commission's archived minutes from 2 years prior, which suggested an altogether different location, a large, undeveloped parcel of land adjacent to Willow Creek Park. This alternative plan had been swiftly rejected due to environmental concerns and high acquisition costs. Why would they even propose such an unsuitable site? Ilara mused aloud, pointing to the rejected plan. It makes no sense. The original site is clearly better. Mrs. Albright's eyes narrowed. Unless someone wanted that alternative site to look less appealing than it actually was. Unless someone had a vested interest in the current proposed site becoming more valuable. What's Harrison building on the other side of town? Ilara quickly looked up the latest projects of Harrison Holdings. Sure enough, Harrison was aggressively acquiring land adjacent to the proposed new municipal water treatment facility site. He wasn't building anything there yet, but his purchases indicated he was assembling a large, strategic parcel. He knew. Ilara breathed, a chilling realization dawning on her. He knew where the facility would eventually go, even before it was officially decided. He was buying up all the land around it. Exactly, Mrs. Albright confirmed, a grim satisfaction in her voice. He likely influenced the decision to put the facility there, then quietly bought up the surrounding properties for a song. Once the public project is announced, his land values skyrocket. It's a classic insider trading maneuver, but on a grand civic scale. And that rejected water treatment plant site near the park, that was likely a red herring, designed to make people think that park area was safe from development for infrastructure, when his real plan was commercial. This discovery was a revelation. It tied Arthur Harrison's macro-level corruption directly to the micro-level cruelty embodied by his son. It showed a pattern of manipulation, of using public infrastructure and influence for private gain, and it exposed the scale of his ambition. He wasn't just a greedy developer. He was a silent puppet master, pulling the strings of Willow Creek. They also delved deeper into Blake's past. While Ilara had initially been driven by the immediate injustice to Buster, Mrs. Albright urged her to see the bigger picture. Blake's behavior isn't isolated. It's a learned pattern. He's been allowed to get away with things his entire life because of his father's money and power. Document every incident, no matter how small. Ilara scoured old online forums, local newspaper archives, many of which Mrs. Albright, with her old press passes, still had access to, and even social media. She found numerous anecdotal reports of Blake's past transgressions, petty vandalism, bullying classmates, reckless driving incidents that mysteriously disappeared from police records. It painted a picture of a young man utterly devoid of consequence, echoing his father's casual disregard for rules and laws. The incident with Buster was just the latest, most egregious example as the days turned into weeks. The threats subtly intensified. Ilara's apartment suffered a series of minor inconveniences her internet would inexplicably cut out for hours. Her car tires were once found suspiciously deflated, and once, a dead bird was left on her doorstep. They were small enough to be dismissed as coincidences, but together, they formed a chilling pattern. Buster's growls became more frequent, his protective instincts on high alert. He would often stare intently at the windows or the door, a low rumble in his chest, making Ilara's skin prickle. One evening, as Ilara walked Buster in a quiet part of the park, a car slowed beside them. The tinted window rolled down just enough for Ilara to catch a glimpse of a shadowed face. "You're getting too curious, little girl," a deep voice rasped. "Some things are better left alone." The car sped off. Ilara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Buster let out a furious bark, straining against his leash. She hurried home, rattled but not broken. The threats were no longer anonymous phone calls. They were in person, unnerving encounters. They're escalating. Ilara. Mrs. Albright observed when Ilara recounted the incident. It means we're close to something big. But it also means you need to be extremely careful. Their collective evidence grew into a formidable pile land deeds, zoning documents, sworn statements from intimidated residents, financial records hinting at illicit payments, and a disturbing chronicle of Blake's past behavior. Each piece of paper, each witness account, was a small victory. Ilara, once overwhelmed, now felt a strange sense of clarity and purpose. She was no longer just a quiet librarian. She was an amateur detective, a reluctant warrior fighting for her town. But a critical question remained: how to expose it all. The police were compromised. Local media was unlikely to challenge Arthur Harrison without irrefutable, public proof. They needed a way to deliver a knockout blow, something undeniable that would force the hand of justice. "We need to hit them where it hurts most," Mrs. Albright mused, tapping her chin thoughtfully. "Their reputation, their public image, and we need to do it in a way that generates immediate, undeniable public outrage, something that the authorities can't possibly ignore." They began brainstorming. Hours filled with discarded ideas and frustrated sighs. A press conference too easily controlled by Harrison. A direct confrontation too dangerous. They needed a stage, a moment, a platform that would put Harrison on the defensive, exposing him and his son to the full glare of public scrutiny. Then, Mrs. Albright's eyes gleamed with an idea. "Arthur Harrison is a showman, isn't he? He loves the spotlight. He loves to announce his vision for Willow Creek. And the Willow Creek Gateway Project is his magnum opus. He'll want a grand unveiling." Ilara felt a sudden surge of adrenaline. The groundbreaking ceremony. He's been planning it for months. A big public event, with all the local dignitaries. "Exactly," Mrs. Albright exclaimed, a rare smile gracing her lips. "He'll be there, basking in the glory, presenting his sanitized version of progress. And that, dear Ilara, is where we strike. We combine the narrative, the cruelty to your dog, the systematic bullying of the residents, the manipulation of town resources. We weave it all together into one undeniable narrative of abuse of power. We show them the ugly truth behind his polished facade." The plan was audacious, risky, and incredibly dangerous. But it was also brilliant. It would force the truth into the open, in front of the very people Harrison sought to impress and manipulate. Ilara looked at Buster, sleeping peacefully at her feet, a faint scar visible where the kick had landed. He was her reason. And now, she had a clear path, however perilous, to his justice, and the justice of their entire community. The timid Ilara was gone. A woman forged in fire, armed with truth, was ready to step onto the stage. The audacious plan to expose Arthur Harrison at his own groundbreaking ceremony filled Ilara with a volatile mix of dread and exhilaration. It was the kind of high-stakes gamble she had only read about in thrillers, never imagining she'd be living one. The thought of confronting such a powerful man in public sent shivers down her spine. But the image of Buster's pained yelp, the memory of Mr. Henderson's defeated eyes, fueled a courage she hadn't known she possessed. Mrs. Albright, however, was in her element. Her eyes gleamed with the familiar fire of a journalist on the hunt. "This is it, Ilara," she declared, laying out a meticulous timeline. "The climax. We have to make it count. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, has to hit like a hammer." Their immediate task was to refine their presentation. It couldn't just be a jumble of facts. It needed to be a compelling narrative, one that would resonate with the public and force the hand of authorities. Mrs. Albright, drawing on decades of experience, coached Alara relentlessly. Emotion is key. Dear, she explained, facts are important, but people respond to feeling. Start with Buster. That's your hook. It's relatable. Everyone understands cruelty to an innocent animal. Then, tie it to the larger pattern of Harrison's disregard for the community. Show them that the kick in the park was just a small part of a much bigger, more insidious pattern of abuse of power. They spent hours crafting Alara's statement, practicing her delivery. Mrs. Albright pushed her out of her comfort zone, urging her to project her voice, to hold eye contact, to convey the conviction she felt deep within. Alara, initially hesitant, found her voice growing stronger with each rehearsal. She realized she wasn't just speaking for herself or for Buster. She was speaking for Mr. Henderson, for Mrs. Petrov, for all the quiet people in Willow Creek who had been silenced by Harrison's influence. Their evidence was meticulously organized into a series of binders, the veterinary report, enlarged and clear. Copies of the deceptive land offers made to elderly residents, annotated with notes from their interviews, the puzzling original and rerouted sewage line maps, highlighted to show the discrepancy, records of donations from Harrison-linked shell corporations to local officials, and a chilling timeline of Blake's past incidents, compiled from various sources. We need undeniable proof, Alara. Mrs. Albright stressed. Something they can't simply dismiss as he said. She said, visuals, documents, things they can't argue with, to bolster their case. Mrs. Albright had reached out to a few trusted contacts from her journalistic days, a retired forensics expert, a former legal aid attorney. They reviewed the evidence, offering crucial advice on how to present it in a legally sound and impactful way. The legal aid attorney, a sharp woman named Ms. Davies, confirmed their suspicions while Harrison's actions were often technically legal. They operated in a gray area of ethical manipulation. It's not outright fraud until you can prove intent and direct financial harm caused by deception, Ms. Davies had explained. But you've built a strong circumstantial case for intimidation, coercion, and abuse of influence, especially if you can make it public. The public announcement of the Willow Creek Gateway Project groundbreaking ceremony was made with great fanfare. Banners hung across Main Street. Local news channels ran promotional segments, and the mayor himself was scheduled to speak. Praising Arthur Harrison's visionary leadership, it was exactly the grand stage Mrs. Albright had envisioned. The ceremony was set to take place at the edge of Willow Creek Park, ironically, right near the area where Buster had been attacked. As the day of the ceremony approached, the tension in Alara's small apartment was almost unbearable. Buster, still a little stiff from his injuries but regaining his playful spirit, seemed to sense the change in atmosphere. He would follow Alara everywhere, nudging her hand, offering comfort in his silent, loyal way. His mere presence was a constant reminder of why they were doing this. Mrs. Albright, despite her outward calm, was also feeling the pressure. She meticulously reviewed every detail, double-checking their sources, anticipating every possible counterargument Harrison might employ. He won't go down without a fight, Alara, she warned. He'll try to discredit you, to paint you as a disgruntled eccentric. You must be prepared. They even anticipated physical interference. If anyone tries to stop you, Alara, keep going, Mrs. Albright instructed. Make a scene. Draw attention. The more they try to silence you, the more suspicious they'll look. She also arranged for a few of her old journalistic colleagues, independent reporters who valued truth over corporate influence. To be present at the ceremony, they wouldn't know the full extent of the plan, but they would be there, cameras ready, if something dramatic unfolded. The night before the ceremony, Ilara found herself unable to sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind a whirlwind of fear and determination. What if it all went wrong? What if Harrison found a way to spin it, to turn it against her? What if she failed Buster and Mr. Henderson and Mrs. Petrov? Buster, sensing her distress, hopped onto the bed, nudging his head against her hand. Ilara stroked his fur, finding solace in his steady breathing, his warm presence. "We're going to do this, Buster," she whispered into his soft fur. "For you, for all of us." The morning of the groundbreaking dawned clear and bright, a beautiful autumn day that seemed to mock the darkness brewing beneath the town's surface. Ilara dressed carefully, choosing a simple but professional outfit. She felt a strange duality, the quiet librarian on the outside, and a determined warrior seething with purpose on the inside. Buster, now fully recovered, was unusually quiet, sensing the gravity of the day as they left the apartment. Ilara saw the familiar dark sedan parked down the street. She met the driver's gaze briefly, a burly man with a stony face, and felt a surge of defiance. Let them watch, she thought. They'll get a show they never expected. Mrs. Albright met her at a discreet location a few blocks from the park entrance. She was impeccably dressed, her silver hair neatly pinned, radiating an aura of calm authority. She carried a large, unassuming tote bag, which Ilara knew contained their meticulously prepared evidence. "Ready, dear?" Mrs. Albright asked, her eyes searching Ilara's. Ilara took a deep breath, her gaze falling upon Buster, who looked up at her with his usual trusting, soulful eyes. She knelt down, giving him a quick, firm hug. "As I'll ever be," she said, rising. They approached the park, joining the growing crowd that had gathered for the ceremony. A large stage had been erected, adorned with banners proclaiming Willow Creek's future begins now. The local mayor, several town council members, and, of course, Arthur Harrison himself, stood on the stage, beaming and shaking hands. Blake Harrison was there too, lounging casually at the edge of the stage, smirking and texting on his phone, oblivious to the storm about to break. Ilara felt a wave of anger at the sight of him. His casual indifference to the pain he had caused, to the pain his family had caused, was infuriating. It steeled her resolve. They strategically positioned themselves near the front of the crowd, close enough to the stage to be seen and heard, but far enough not to immediately raise suspicion. Ilara clutched Buster's leash, her knuckles white. He sat patiently beside her, a quiet, loyal presence, his eyes fixed on her face. The mayor began to speak, his voice booming over the loudspeakers, extolling Arthur Harrison's generosity and vision. He spoke of progress, of economic growth, of a brighter future for Willow Creek. The words felt hollow, a cruel mockery of the truth Ilara held in her hands. As the mayor finished, he gestured dramatically towards Arthur Harrison. The powerful developer stepped to the podium, a smug smile on his face, ready to bask in the adulation. This was their moment. This was where Ilara, the quiet librarian, would do something no one, especially Arthur and Blake Harrison, would ever expect. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but a strange calm descended upon her. She looked at Buster, then at the man who represented everything she was fighting against. It was time to unleash the truth. Arthur Harrison stepped to the podium, his smile wide and confident, a predatory gleam in his eyes as he surveyed the assembled crowd. The setting sun glinted off the newly erected Willow Creek Gateway Project banner behind him, casting a golden hue over his smug face. He began to speak, his voice resonating with practiced charm. Words of progress, opportunity, and community betterment flowing smoothly. He was a master orator, weaving a tapestry of false promises that, for years, had captivated and misled the town. Alara felt the familiar icy tendrils of fear creeping up her spine. But this time, a fierce surge of defiance rose to meet it. She looked at Buster, who sat patiently beside her, his warm weight a grounding presence. This wasn't just about Buster. It was about every quiet person, every vulnerable resident Harrison had preyed upon. Mrs. Albright, standing a step behind Alara, gave her a subtle, encouraging nod. She unobtrusively reached into her tote bag, her hand brushing against the neatly organized binders. It was now or never. As Harrison paused for a round of polite applause, Alara took a deep breath. She reached into the smaller bag Mrs. Albright had given her, pulling out a large, laminated printout of the veterinary report, clearly showing Buster's injuries. "Excuse me," Alara's voice, though initially a little shaky, carried surprisingly well in the sudden lull. It wasn't a shout, but a clear, distinct interruption that cut through the polite murmur of the crowd. All heads turned. Arthur Harrison, mid-sentence, faltered, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the young woman from his son's casual dismissal. Blake, lounging nearby, finally looked up from his phone, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face as he recognized Alara and Buster. "What is the meaning of this?" Harrison demanded, his charming facade cracking, replaced by a scowl. "We are in the middle of a public ceremony." Alara stepped forward, holding the vet report aloft. Her heart was pounding like a war drum. But she met Harrison's gaze unflinchingly. "You speak of community betterment." "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice growing stronger, gaining momentum with each word. "But your definition of community betterment seems to involve destroying our park and trampling over the very people who built this town." A ripple went through the crowd. Murmurs began to swell. The independent reporters Mrs. Albright had alerted immediately swung their cameras towards Alara, sensing a story. "Who is this woman?" someone whispered. "She's a disgruntled individual, clearly disturbed." Harrison scoffed, trying to regain control. "Security," but Alara ignored him. She pointed to the detailed injury report. "This is a veterinary report for my dog, Buster. He suffered severe internal bruising right here, in this park, just weeks ago, kicked violently by your son, Blake Harrison." A gasp went through the crowd. All eyes darted to Blake, who suddenly looked pale, his casual smirk evaporating. "Lies. She's lying," Blake blurted out, stepping forward, his voice cracking. "My father's going to sue you." Alara didn't even look at him. She kept her gaze fixed on Arthur Harrison, her voice gaining a cold, righteous fury. "And that, Mr. Harrison, is just the beginning. Your son's casual cruelty towards an innocent animal is a direct reflection of your own casual cruelty towards this entire community." Mrs. Albright then stepped forward, her quiet demeanor belying the power of the documents she held. "This isn't about an isolated incident, ladies and gentlemen," she stated, her voice clear and authoritative, cutting through the rising clamor. "This is about a pattern of intimidation, coercion, and outright manipulation of our town's resources for private gain." She opened a binder, pulling out several documents. Mr. Harrison talks about opportunity, but what about the opportunities he's stolen from our elderly residents here? She announced, holding up in large copies of the deceptive land offers. Are the so-called offers made to Mr. Thomas Henderson and Mrs. Elena Petrov lowball figures, followed by threats of property condemnation, coercing them to sell their lifelong homes for a pittance? The crowd murmured louder, many looking towards Mr. Henderson and Mrs. Petrov, who stood tearfully in the front row. Nodding in affirmation, Arthur Harrison's face was now a mask of barely contained rage. This is outrageous slander. These are private business dealings that directly impact the public good. Mr. Harrison, Elara retorted, now fueled by an unstoppable wave of adrenaline. Just like your grand plan for this park, you claim it's for Willow Creek's future. But what about the future of a green space that our children play in? What about the future of families who will lose their homes? She then held up the two maps, the original sewage line plan and the inexplicably rerouted one. And what about this? Mr. Harrison, she challenged, her voice ringing with accusation. Why was a perfectly logical and cheaper sewage line rerouted at significant public expense? When the original path went directly through this park, unless you already knew, years ago, that this park would no longer be public land. Destined for your gateway project, the implication hung in the air, chilling and damning. The whispers in the crowd turned into outright exclamations of disbelief and anger. The news cameras zoomed in, capturing every nuance of Harrison's rapidly deteriorating composure. "This is a conspiracy," Harrison bellowed, his voice losing its polished edge, turning coarse and desperate. "A ridiculous fabrication by two disgruntled women. A fabrication. Mr. Harrison." Mrs. Albright interjected, her voice steady and calm, lending weight to every word. "Or is it simply the truth you've worked so hard to conceal the truth about your shell corporations, your questionable donations to public officials, and your relentless pursuit of profit at the expense of this community?" She then produced another set of documents, the records of donations from anonymous shell companies to the campaigns of several town council members and the mayor himself. "These are public records, readily available to anyone who bothers to look," Mrs. Albright stated, holding them up for the cameras. Coincidentally, these officials have consistently voted in favor of every one of Mr. Harrison's projects, including this park rezoning. The mayor, standing beside Harrison, looked visibly uncomfortable, nervously adjusting his tie. "And finally," Elara said, her voice full of a quiet, devastating power, "let's not forget the character of your family. Mr. Harrison, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, does it? Your son, Blake, who casually kicks an innocent dog, a dog who posed no threat simply because he can. That kind of cruelty, that sense of entitlement, that disregard for life permeates everything you do." She stepped back, allowing Buster to come forward slightly. He sat beside her, calm and dignified, his presence a silent testament to the suffering he had endured. The small, barely visible scar on his side spoke volumes. The crowd erupted. The carefully orchestrated PR event had dissolved into chaos. People were shouting, "Shame and justice for Buster." Reporters were pushing forward, thrusting microphones towards Elara and Mrs. Albright, demanding answers. The local dignitaries on stage looked aghast, some trying to distance themselves from Harrison. Arthur Harrison, his face crimson with fury and humiliation, gestured wildly at security, But it was too late. The dam had burst. The truth, meticulously uncovered by the quiet librarian and the shrewd journalist, was now out, exposed under the harsh light of public scrutiny. Blake, utterly humiliated, had retreated, trying to melt into the crowd. Ilara stood tall amidst the maelstrom, Buster at her side. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer timid. She had stared down the most powerful man in Willow Creek, and she had spoken her truth. And as the public outcry swelled, she knew, with a certainty that resonated deep in her bones, that this time, justice would not be denied. The groundwork for a new, unexpected future had just been laid. The meticulously planned groundbreaking ceremony for the Willow Creek Gateway project dissolved into utter pandemonium. Arthur Harrison, his face contorted in a mask of fury and disbelief, was shouting. But his words were drowned out by the roar of the crowd. The polite applause had morphed into a cacophony of angry shouts. "Shame on you! Harrison! Justice for Buster! Save our park!" News cameras, initially positioned to capture Harrison's triumphal announcement, now swiveled wildly, capturing every angle of the unfolding chaos. Microphones were thrust into the faces of bewildered town officials, who stammered incoherently, caught between their allegiance to Harrison and the undeniable public outrage. Blake, pale and visibly shaken, tried to slink away from the stage. But a few eagle-eyed reporters, alerted by Mrs. Albright, immediately recognized him and began to hound him with questions about the dog. Ilara stood her ground, Buster a steadfast presence beside her. The adrenaline coursing through her veins was intoxicating, a powerful counterpoint to the fear that had once paralyzed her. She felt a strange sense of clarity amidst the chaos, a quiet satisfaction. The truth, painstakingly unearthed, had finally been unleashed. Mrs. Albright, ever the professional, subtly steered Ilara away from the immediate crush of the crowd, guiding her towards the independent reporters she had contacted. "Ilara, tell them your story," she urged, her voice calm but firm. "Tell them everything. Don't hold back." Ilara, still vibrating with the energy of the confrontation, found herself speaking with an eloquence she never knew she possessed. She recounted Buster's attack, the police's dismissal, the months of quiet investigation, the discovery of Harrison's land schemes, and the intimidation tactics against the elderly residents. She spoke with a quiet intensity that was far more powerful than any shout, her voice resonating with sincerity and raw emotion. Buster, sensing the gravity of the moment, sat quietly beside her, occasionally nudging her hand, his presence a poignant visual testament to her words. The story, particularly the detail of Blake Harrison kicking an innocent dog, hit a raw nerve in a town that prided itself on its community spirit. Such casual cruelty was anathema. The image of the unassuming librarian and her scruffy, injured dog standing up to the town's most powerful man was compelling. A David and Goliath narrative tailor-made for public consumption. Within hours, the local news channels, initially hesitant to challenge Arthur Harrison, were forced to cover the story. The independent reporters, unburdened by corporate ties, had already broken the news online, complete with shaky but damning footage of Ilara's confrontation and Harrison's enraged reaction. The hashtag #ShawshJusticeForBuster began to trend on social media, quickly followed by Shawsh Save Willow Creek Park and Shawsh Harrison Corruption. The public outcry was immediate and overwhelming. Pet owners, animal rights activists, and concerned citizens from Willow Creek and beyond rallied behind Ilara. Calls flooded the police department, the mayor's office, and the town council, demanding a full investigation. The story spread like wildfire, picked up by regional news outlets and even national online platforms. Alara Vance, the quiet librarian, and Buster, the scruffy rescue dog, became unlikely symbols of resistance against corporate greed and unchecked power. Arthur Harrison, blindsided by the public nature of the attack, tried desperately to control the narrative. His PR team issued a statement dismissing Alara as a disgruntled individual with a history of irrational behavior, and the claims as baseless slander. They even tried to paint Buster's injury as an unfortunate accident. But the public wasn't buying it. The raw emotion of Alara's testimony, combined with the visible evidence of Buster's recovery, resonated far more deeply than Harrison's carefully crafted lies. Blake Harrison, meanwhile, found himself an instant pariah. His social media accounts were flooded with angry comments, and he was forced to shut them down. His friends, sensing the shift in public opinion, quickly distanced themselves from him. The police, now under immense pressure, were forced to open a formal investigation into the animal cruelty charges, something they had dismissed just weeks prior. For Alara, the sudden thrust into the spotlight was disorienting. Her phone, usually silent, now rang incessantly with calls from reporters, well-wishers, and even strangers offering support. Her quiet apartment, once her sanctuary, felt exposed. Mrs. Albright, however, was a steadying presence. She helped Alara navigate the media requests, advising her on what to say, how to protect herself, and how to keep the focus on the truth. "Don't let them turn this into a circus, dear," Mrs. Albright cautioned. "Keep it focused on the facts, on the injustice. Your sincerity is your greatest weapon." Alara, though exhausted, found a new strength in this public validation. The fear that had once defined her began to recede, replaced by a quiet confidence. She gave interviews, her voice still soft, but now imbued with an undeniable authority. She spoke not with anger, but with a calm, unwavering conviction, letting the facts speak for themselves. She always made sure to include Buster in her interviews, his presence a powerful, silent counterpoint to Harrison's denials. The community, once seemingly intimidated into silence, began to rally around Alara. Mr. Henderson and Mrs. Petrov, emboldened by Alara's courage, came forward publicly, sharing their own stories of intimidation and coercion by Harrison Holdings. Other elderly residents, who had also been targeted, followed suit, a grassroots movement. Citizens for Willow Creek quickly formed, organizing protests and demanding accountability. The police, no longer able to ignore the overwhelming public pressure, announced a full, independent investigation into Arthur Harrison's business practices, focusing on the land deals, the zoning changes, and the alleged political influence. The mayor, facing a potential recall, issued a statement promising full cooperation and transparency. The first tangible sign of justice came swiftly. Blake Harrison was formally charged with animal cruelty, while a minor charge in the grand scheme of things. It was a significant symbolic victory. It meant that for the first time in his life, Blake would have to face consequences for his actions, consequences that could no longer be swept under the rug by his father's influence. Arthur Harrison, despite his vast resources, found himself on the defensive. His carefully constructed empire, built on a foundation of quiet manipulation, was now exposed to the harsh glare of public scrutiny. His business partners began to distance themselves. Fearing the fallout, his political allies suddenly became unavailable. The Willow Creek Gateway Project, once touted as his crowning achievement, was now mired in controversy, its future uncertain. Alara, watching the news reports from her small apartment, felt a profound sense of vindication. It wasn't over yet, not by a long shot, but the tide had turned. The quiet woman, once invisible, had ignited a fire that was now consuming the very forces that had sought to silence her. And by her side, Buster, fully recovered and more vibrant than ever, was a living testament to the power of standing up for what is right, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant the initial injustice. The fight had only just begun, but Alara was ready. She had found her voice, and Willow Creek was finally listening. The initial wave of public outrage had ignited a firestorm, but Alara and Mrs. Albright knew that sustained pressure was crucial. Arthur Harrison was a master manipulator, and he wouldn't surrender his empire without a bitter fight. The legal wheels, though finally turning, often moved agonizingly slowly. Their task now was to keep the narrative alive, to ensure that public attention didn't wane, and that the authorities remained compelled to act. He'll try to buy off witnesses, discredit the evidence, or muddy the waters with counter-accusations. Mrs. Albright predicted, "We need to stay ahead of him, keep digging, keep presenting the truth, and most importantly, keep the human element alive." They focused their efforts on consolidating the evidence and making it accessible. Alara, leveraging her librarian skills, meticulously categorized every document, the property deeds, the confusing legal notices sent to residents, the internal planning memos, and the financial records hinting at Harrison's network of influence. Mrs. Albright, meanwhile, acted as their media liaison, ensuring that the collected evidence reached reputable news organizations beyond Willow Creek. Expanding the story's reach, the charges against Blake Harrison for animal cruelty became a key symbolic battleground. Arthur Harrison immediately hired a high-powered defense team, painting his son as a victim of a witch hunt orchestrated by a crazy dog lady. They tried to portray Buster's injuries as minor, or even self-inflicted, but Alara, with Mrs. Albright's coaching, fought back with quiet dignity. She presented Buster himself at a brief preliminary hearing. The sight of the now thriving dog, a small scar visible on his side, speaking volumes. The vet, Dr. Aris, gave compelling testimony, detailing the severity of the internal bruising. The public, galvanized by the initial outcry, responded with an outpouring of support. Rallies were held outside the courthouse, drawing significant media attention. Children brought handmade signs, "Buster for Justice," and "Animals have rights too." The sheer volume of support made it impossible for the local judge to dismiss the charges, and a trial date was set. This was a critical win, forcing the Harrisons to engage in a public legal battle rather than sweeping it under the rug. Simultaneously, the official investigation into Arthur Harrison's land dealings gained momentum. Detectives, no longer able to ignore the mounting evidence and public pressure, began interviewing the elderly residents Alara and Mrs. Albright had identified. Mr. Henderson, initially hesitant, found courage in the collective support. He detailed the subtle threats, the confusing legal documents, and the unbearable stress Harrison's tactics had inflicted upon him. Mrs. Petrov, another victim, tearfully recounted how she felt trapped, forced to consider selling her family home of 60 years. Alara and Mrs. Albright assisted the investigators, providing them with their meticulously organized binders of evidence. The rerouted sewage line map, in particular, caught the attention of the State Environmental Protection Agency, which launched its own inquiry into potential violations and conflicts of interest in the municipal planning process. The financial transactions involving shell corporations were flagged by a state anti-corruption task force, hinting at potential fraud and bribery. Arthur Harrison's carefully constructed facade of legitimacy was crumbling, brick by painstaking brick. But Harrison was a formidable opponent. He unleashed his vast legal resources, filing defamation lawsuits against Alara and Mrs. Albright, attempting to drown them in legal fees and intimidate them into silence. He hired private investigators to dig into their pasts, searching for any vulnerability, any perceived flaw that could be exploited to discredit them. "This is classic Harrison," Mrs. Albright scoffed. "Reviewing the defamation notices, he'll try to bleed us dry. Don't worry. I have contacts for pro bono legal aid for cases like this. We expected this." Indeed, a network of legal professionals, alerted by Mrs. Albright's journalistic contacts, stepped forward, offering their services to Ilara and Mrs. Albright free of charge. They saw the case not just as a local dispute, but as a crucial fight for justice against corporate overreach. The legal battle began to resemble a chess match, with Harrison making aggressive moves, and Ilara and Mrs. Albright, guided by their expert team, countering with precision and public truth. The psychological toll on Ilara was immense. She was no longer just dealing with the raw pain of Buster's attack. She was a public figure, a target. Every decision, every public appearance, every word she uttered was scrutinized. Sleep became elusive, her nights often punctuated by restless tossing and turning, haunted by the specter of Harrison's power. Yet, through it all, Buster remained her anchor. He would curl up beside her, his soft snores a comforting rhythm, his simple, trusting presence a constant reminder of why she fought. One afternoon, Ilara received an unexpected visit at the library. An old colleague, Mr. Davies, a quiet, unassuming man who had worked at the library for decades, approached her nervously. "Ilara," he whispered, glancing around, I have something for you." He pressed a thumb drive into her hand. "I heard what you're doing. It's brave. I found this when I was cleaning out some old storage boxes. It's an old hard drive from a former town council member. They asked me to dispose of it years ago, but I never did." He looked at her, his eyes full of a quiet, hesitant resolve. "I think it might have something useful." About Harrison, Ilara thanked him, her heart pounding. The potential for a new breakthrough filled her with a nervous anticipation. When she and Mrs. Albright later analyzed the contents of the thumb drive, they struck gold. It contained years of internal communications, emails, and financial records from a town council member who had served during the early phases of Harrison's land acquisitions. There were encrypted messages, carefully coded, hinting at incentives for favorable votes on zoning changes, reimbursements for expenses related to specific land deals, and explicit instructions to prioritize Harrison Holdings projects. It was the smoking gun they needed, direct evidence of corrupt agreements and potential bribery. "This is it, Ilara." Mrs. Albright breathed, her voice filled with awe and triumph as she decrypted a particularly damning email. "This links Harrison directly to the public officials. This proves collusion. This isn't just unethical, it's illegal. This changes everything." The discovery of the thumb drive elevated the entire investigation. The state anti-corruption task force immediately took over the lead from local authorities, recognizing the scale of the potential charges. Subpoenas were issued, financial accounts frozen, and several former town officials found themselves under intense scrutiny. The legal battle was no longer just about Buster or the park. It was about exposing a deep-seated network of corruption that had held Willow Creek in its grip for years. Arthur Harrison, facing undeniable evidence and a full-scale state investigation, became increasingly desperate. His public statements grew more erratic, his legal team more aggressive in its tactics. He even tried to use his media contacts to smear Ilara, publishing articles questioning her mental stability and accusing her of being part of a larger, politically motivated conspiracy. But by now, Ilara's public image as a quiet, courageous advocate was too strong. The attempts to discredit her only backfired, strengthening public sympathy as the legal net tightened around him. Arthur Harrison's carefully cultivated image as a benevolent developer shattered completely. Investors began pulling out of the Gateway project. Wary of being associated with the escalating scandal, banks reviewed his loans, threatening to call them in. His empire, built on shadow and influence, was now exposed to the harsh light of truth, and it was beginning to crumble. Ilara, sitting with Buster by the window, watching the town she had fought so hard to protect, felt a quiet sense of achievement. The fight was far from over, but the turning point had passed. Justice, though slow, was now on an unstoppable trajectory. The quiet woman who once felt invisible had become the catalyst for a seismic shift in her community. Proving that even the smallest spark of courage could ignite a revolution, the discovery of the thumb drive was the crack in Arthur Harrison's meticulously constructed fortress, with the state anti-corruption task force now actively involved. The investigation moved with a speed and intensity that local authorities had never dared to employ. The initial charges against Blake Harrison for animal cruelty, though seemingly minor, had been the fuse that ignited a much larger explosion. Ilara and Mrs. Albright found themselves at the heart of a full-blown criminal investigation. They spent long hours with state prosecutors and detectives, meticulously going over every piece of evidence. The decrypted emails from the thumb drive provided damning proof of what Mrs. Albright had always suspected: direct communication between Arthur Harrison and key town council members, discussing favorable considerations and expense reimbursements linked to critical zoning votes for the Willow Creek Gateway project. These weren't subtle hints. They were explicit instructions on how to push through his agenda, overriding environmental concerns and community objections. The scale of Arthur Harrison's deception became clearer with each passing day. He hadn't just used intimidation tactics. He had systematically subverted the democratic process of Willow Creek. Witnesses who had previously been too terrified to speak now came forward, emboldened by the prospect of justice and the overwhelming public support for Ilara. Former employees of Harrison Holdings, feeling the heat of the state investigation, offered to testify about unethical practices and pressure to falsify documents. Blake Harrison's trial for animal cruelty, though secondary to the main investigation, became a public spectacle. The prosecution, seizing the opportunity to highlight the Harrison family's pattern of disregard, presented a powerful case, Ilara testified, her voice steady and clear as she recounted the horrific details of Buster's attack. Dr. Aris provided compelling veterinary evidence, meticulously explaining Buster's injuries. Even Buster made a brief appearance in the courtroom, his calm demeanor and small scar a silent, powerful testament. Blake, accustomed to escaping consequences, appeared visibly uncomfortable under the harsh glare of the media and public scrutiny. His high-powered legal team tried to paint Alara as unstable and Buster's injuries as exaggerated. But the evidence, combined with Alara's undeniable sincerity and the outpouring of public sympathy, was too strong to counter after a week-long trial. The jury returned a guilty verdict. Blake Harrison was convicted of animal cruelty. While the sentence was relatively light, a hefty fine, probation, and mandatory community service at an animal shelter, it was a monumental moral victory. For the first time in his privileged life, Blake Harrison faced public accountability for his cruelty. This conviction sent shockwaves through Willow Creek, confirming the public's worst suspicions about the Harrison family. It also provided a significant boost to the ongoing investigation into Arthur Harrison. The public now saw clearly that the apple did not fall far from the tree. With the evidence from the thumb drive and the mounting testimonies, the state task force moved to a grand jury. Within weeks, Arthur Harrison was formally indicted on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and bribery. The charges were severe, carrying significant prison sentences. His assets were frozen, his business dealings put under immediate review, and the Willow Creek Gateway project was effectively halted, its future now entirely uncertain. The news of Arthur Harrison's indictment sent shockwaves far beyond Willow Creek. It was picked up by national news channels, becoming a cautionary tale of unchecked power and corporate corruption. Political commentators analyzed the case, highlighting the power of grassroots activism and the courage of individuals to stand up against seemingly insurmountable odds. Alara, once a quiet, invisible librarian, was now a public hero. She received fan mail, invitations to speak at community events, and even job offers from nonprofit organizations dedicated to fighting corruption and advocating for animal rights. The transformation was overwhelming, but she carried herself with a humble grace, always deferring credit to Mrs. Albright and the countless citizens who had supported her. Despite the triumphs, the emotional toll on Alara was immense. The relentless media attention, the constant threat of legal counterattacks from Harrison's lawyers, and the sheer weight of responsibility were exhausting. There were moments of doubt, moments when she simply wanted her quiet life back. But then she would look at Buster, now fully recovered, bounding through the park with his characteristic joy, and remember why she had started this fight. His innocent trust was her constant motivation. Mrs. Albright, seeing Alara's fatigue, became even more of a mentor and friend. She helped Alara process the emotional burden, reminding her of the immense good she was doing. "This isn't just about Harrison, dear," she would say. "It's about reminding everyone that power doesn't make you untouchable, that justice can and will prevail." Arthur Harrison, cornered and desperate, launched one last, furious counterattack. He hired a high-profile PR firm to disseminate a massive smear campaign against Alara and Mrs. Albright. They dug up every tiny detail of their lives, twisting facts, manufacturing lies, attempting to paint Alara as a vengeful, unstable woman and Mrs. Albright as a bitter, washed-up journalist seeking a final headline. They used anonymous online forums and shady news blogs to spread disinformation, hoping to erode public trust, but their efforts largely backfired. The public, by now deeply invested in Alara's story and disgusted by Harrison's tactics, saw through the transparent attempts to discredit her. Every news smear only seemed to solidify public sympathy for Alara and increase disdain for Harrison. Mainstream news outlets, Wary of being associated with such blatant character assassination, largely ignored Harrison's desperate attempts. The focus remained squarely on the mounting evidence against Arthur Harrison. Prosecutors built a powerful case, preparing for a trial that promised to be one of Willow Creek's most significant in decades, the future of Willow Creek, once seemingly dictated by Harrison Holdings, now hung in the balance, awaiting the outcome of this monumental legal battle. For the first time in many years, the air in Willow Creek felt different. A sense of hope, of renewed civic engagement, permeated the town. Residents attended town council meetings, spoke up, and organized community events to celebrate their shared victory. The park, once threatened, was now cherished more than ever. It was no longer just a patch of green. It was a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of a quiet woman and her loyal dog who refused to let injustice stand. The climax was approaching, and Ilara, though weary, stood ready for the final confrontation, knowing that an entire community stood with her. The trial of Arthur Harrison was the culmination of months of relentless work, a legal spectacle that captivated Willow Creek and drew national attention. The courtroom, usually a somber space, buzzed with an electric tension. Every seat was filled, with a long line of hopeful spectators stretching out into the hallway. News vans lined the streets outside, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, ready to broadcast every development. This wasn't just a trial. It was a reckoning for a town that had long lived under the shadow of one man's unchecked power. Arthur Harrison, once the epitome of polished confidence, now appeared visibly aged, his face etched with strain. He sat beside his formidable legal team, his usual arrogant smirk replaced by a grim, defensive scowl. The public humiliation of Blake's conviction for animal cruelty had already dealt a significant blow to his image. But these new charges of fraud, conspiracy, and bribery threatened to dismantle his entire empire and land him in prison. The prosecution, led by a sharp, no-nonsense state attorney named Mr. Rodriguez, presented a meticulous and devastating case. They began by painting a vivid picture of Arthur Harrison's modus operandi, a calculated strategy of acquiring land through shell corporations, manipulating zoning laws, and coercing vulnerable residents. The thumb drive, with its encrypted emails and financial records, was the cornerstone of their evidence, providing irrefutable proof of direct communication and illicit payments to town officials. Witness after witness took the stand. Mr. Henderson, his voice trembling but resolute, recounted the threats and the psychological pressure he endured. Mrs. Petrov, tearfully, described how Harrison's agents had tried to force her out of her beloved home. Former town council members, granted immunity in exchange for their testimony, reluctantly admitted to receiving donations and consulting fees from Harrison-linked entities in exchange for favorable votes. The picture that emerged was one of systemic corruption, meticulously orchestrated by Arthur Harrison. Ilara was a pivotal witness for the prosecution. She walked to the stand, her heart pounding, but her gaze steady. She wore a simple, dignified dress and buster. By special request of the prosecution, and with the judge's reluctant approval, was allowed to be present in the courtroom, sitting quietly beside Mrs. Albright in the gallery. His presence was a silent, powerful reminder of the initial act of cruelty that had sparked this entire chain of events. Ilara recounted the incident at the park with chilling clarity, her voice soft but unwavering. She described Blake's casual cruelty, Buster's pain, and her own initial helplessness. Then, She transitioned to her subsequent attempts to seek justice, the police's dismissal, and the dawning realization of Arthur Harrison's deeper corruption. She spoke of her meticulous research, the discovery of the rerouted sewage line, and the pattern of intimidation against the elderly. She didn't speak with anger, but with a quiet, devastating sincerity that resonated deeply with the jury and the public. It wasn't just about my dog, Alara testified, her voice firm. It was about a pattern of powerful people believing they are above the law, above decency, above caring for anyone but themselves. It was about Mr. Harrison's son mirroring his father's disregard for the community, for the vulnerable. During cross-examination, Harrison's defense attorney, a notoriously aggressive lawyer named Mr. Thorne, tried to dismantle Alara's credibility. He questioned her motives, implying she was a vengeful, obsessive individual with a personal vendetta. He tried to portray her as emotionally unstable, suggesting her testimony was colored by a fixation on a minor incident. Ms. Vance, Thorne sneered, isn't it true that you have no formal training in legal investigation, that you are merely a librarian, prone to flights of fancy? Alara met his gaze, unflinching. I am a librarian. Yes, my job is to organize information and help people find the truth. And that is exactly what I did here. The truth, Mr. Thorne, is not a flight of fancy. It is a collection of facts, documents, and the testimonies of people who have been wronged. Thorne pressed further, trying to bait her, to make her lose her composure. You claim to have uncovered a vast conspiracy. Are you suggesting you are smarter than the entire police department, the town council, and every other official who reviewed Mr. Harrison's plans? I am suggesting, Alara replied calmly, her voice echoing with quiet power, that sometimes it takes someone who has nothing to gain and everything to lose to see what others choose to ignore. And sometimes it takes the suffering of an innocent creature to open eyes that have been willfully blind. Her testimony was powerful, a quiet storm that left the courtroom in hushed awe. Even Thorne seemed momentarily taken aback by her composure. Mrs. Albright, too, played a crucial role. She testified as an expert witness, detailing the journalistic techniques she had employed to uncover the truth, lending professional credibility to Alara's findings. She meticulously explained the patterns of shell corporations, the methods of political influence, and the common tactics used by unscrupulous developers. Her testimony was a masterclass in investigative reporting. Laying bare Harrison's intricate web of deceit, Arthur Harrison's defense was built on denial, deflection, and character assassination. Thorne argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the payments were legitimate consulting fees, and that the witnesses were either mistaken or had their own agendas. He tried to paint Harrison as a visionary businessman being unfairly targeted by a small group of disgruntled individuals. He even put Arthur Harrison on the stand, who, despite his lawyer's coaching, struggled to maintain his composure under cross-examination, his arrogance occasionally slipping into outright anger. The trial lasted for several grueling weeks. Each day was a battle, a test of wills. Alara, supported by Mrs. Albright and the growing community of Citizens for Willow Creek, attended every session, a silent, determined presence. Buster, when not in court, became a regular at the rallies outside, his presence a constant reminder of the heart of the matter. Finally, after weeks of testimony, closing arguments were made. Mr. Rodriguez delivered a passionate and compelling summation, weaving together the threads of evidence into an undeniable tapestry of corruption and abuse. She ended her argument by holding up a picture of Buster, taken shortly after his attack. "This," she declared, her voice ringing through the courtroom, "is not just a picture of an injured dog. It is a symbol of every innocent life, every cherished space, every ethical boundary that Arthur Harrison was willing to trample for profit. Justice for Buster is justice for Willow Creek." The jury deliberated for 3 tense days. The entire town held its breath. Alara spent those days pacing her apartment, unable to focus on anything. Buster stayed close, sensing her anxiety, offering silent comfort. Then the call came. The jury had reached a verdict. Alara, with Mrs. Albright by her side, rushed back to the courthouse. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Arthur Harrison sat rigid at the defense table, his face pale. Blake, looking even more gaunt, was also present. The foreman of the jury stood. The judge asked for the verdict. "On the charge of fraud," the foreman's voice rang out, "we find the defendant, Arthur Harrison, guilty." A collective gasp, followed by a wave of relief, swept through the courtroom. Alara felt a tremor go through her. "On the charge of conspiracy," the foreman continued, "we find the defendant, Arthur Harrison, guilty." More gasps, some muffled cheers. Alara's eyes met Mrs. Albright's, and a shared, profound sense of vindication passed between them. "And on the charge of bribery," the foreman concluded, "we find the defendant, Arthur Harrison, guilty." The courtroom erupted. A wave of applause and cheers broke out, quickly gavelled down by the judge. Arthur Harrison's face crumpled, his jaw slack. He looked utterly defeated, his empire shattered, his future irrevocably altered. Blake, beside him, buried his face in his hands. Justice had been served, not just for Buster, but for Mr. Henderson, for Mrs. Petrov, for Willow Creek itself. The quiet woman, armed with truth and an unwavering spirit, had brought down a Goliath. The battle was won, and the town could finally breathe freely. The courtroom erupted in a wave of relief and muted celebration. Gasps turned into hushed cheers, tears of frustration into tears of profound vindication. Arthur Harrison, the seemingly untouchable titan of Willow Creek, was finally brought to his knees. His face, once so arrogant and self-assured, was now a mask of utter devastation. Blake, his son, sat beside him, head bowed, his privileged world crumbling around him. Alara felt an overwhelming surge of emotion, relief, exhaustion, and a deep, quiet satisfaction. Justice. It wasn't just a word. It was a tangible reality. She gripped Mrs. Albright's hand, a silent acknowledgement of their shared journey. Buster, sensing the shift in atmosphere, let out a soft whine, then gently nudged Alara's leg, his tail giving a tentative wag. He was a survivor, and so was she. Outside the courthouse, the scene was chaotic. The press, ravenous for details, swarmed the exits. "Ms. Vance, Ms. Vance." A comment on the verdict. "Mrs. Albright, what does this mean for Harrison Holdings?" Microphones were shoved forward. Cameras flashed, and the roar of the crowd, awaiting the official statements, was deafening. Ms. Rodriguez, the state prosecutor, emerged first, her face stern but triumphant. She announced Arthur Harrison's convictions for fraud, conspiracy, and bribery, emphasizing the severity of the crimes and the commitment of the state to upholding justice. "This verdict sends a clear message," she stated, her voice ringing with authority, "that no one, no matter how powerful or wealthy, is above the law. We commend the courage of Ms. Alara Vance and Mrs. Martha Albright, whose dedication to truth made this outcome possible. When Alara and Mrs. Albright stepped out, escorted by security, the crowd erupted in applause and cheers. Thank you, Alara. You saved our park. Justice for Buster. The sheer outpouring of gratitude and admiration was overwhelming. Alara, accustomed to a life lived in the shadows, felt a profound humility. She was no longer invisible. She was seen, respected, and deeply appreciated. Arthur Harrison's legal team, on the other hand, issued a terse statement promising an appeal, but their words lacked conviction. Harrison himself was swiftly taken into custody, awaiting sentencing. His carefully constructed empire began to unravel at an astonishing pace. Business partners, fearing association with a convicted felon, severed ties, banks called in loans, his various projects across the state, now under intense scrutiny, were frozen or outright canceled. Harrison Holdings, once a symbol of unbridled success, became a cautionary tale of greed. Blake Harrison, already convicted of animal cruelty, faced immediate repercussions. His community service at the local animal shelter began the very next day. It was a stark contrast to his pampered life, forcing him to confront the consequences of his actions in a tangible, humbling way. News reports showed him reluctantly cleaning kennels, his expression a mixture of resentment and shock. While his father faced potential prison time, Blake's public humiliation and forced accountability served as a potent, immediate form of justice. The Willow Creek Gateway Project, the very development that had sparked this entire saga, was officially terminated. The land that Harrison Holdings had coercively acquired from elderly residents was returned to its rightful owners. Thanks to swift legal action initiated by Ms. Rodriguez's office, Mr. Henderson and Mrs. Petrov, their homes and peace of mind restored, wept tears of joy, thanking Alara profusely. The park, the heart of their community, was safe. It would remain a public green space, cherished more than ever. The sense of relief and celebration in Willow Creek was palpable. A community picnic was organized in the very park that had been threatened, a joyous occasion where residents gathered, shared food, and celebrated their collective victory. Alara and Mrs. Albright were the guests of honor, receiving heartfelt thanks from every corner of the town. Alara's life, which had been turned upside down, began to slowly reconfigure itself. The quiet routine of the library still offered comfort, but she was no longer just a librarian. Her story had resonated far and wide. Offers began pouring in invitations to speak at animal welfare conferences, requests for interviews from national magazines, and even inquiries from book publishers interested in her journey. Organizations dedicated to fighting corruption and advocating for vulnerable communities reached out, offering her positions, eager to leverage her unique experience and newfound public platform. "You've found a new calling, dear," Mrs. Albright observed during one of their quiet evenings. Sipping tea in Alara's living room, Buster was curled up between them, snoring softly. "You've always had a good heart, Alara. Now, you have a voice, and a powerful one at that. Don't let it go to waste." Alara, once so timid, felt a stirring of something new within her, a sense of purpose beyond her personal life. She loved the library, but she also felt a responsibility, a drive to use her experience to help others who might be facing similar injustices. She cautiously accepted a few speaking engagements, sharing her story with a quiet dignity that captivated audiences. She found a strange satisfaction in knowing that her ordeal could inspire others, could encourage them to speak up. Her bond with Buster deepened even further. He was not just her companion, he was the catalyst, the living heart of their shared triumph. He basked in the affection of the community, receiving endless belly rubs and treats, oblivious to his role in bringing down a corrupt empire. His recovery was complete, his spirit as joyful and carefree as ever. A constant reminder of the simple, pure goodness they had fought to protect. Alara and Mrs. Albright's friendship blossomed into an unbreakable bond. Mrs. Albright, feeling a renewed sense of purpose herself, decided against fully embracing retirement. She became a mentor, a strategic advisor, and a cherished confidant to Alara, often joining her at speaking engagements, offering wisdom and support. They were an unlikely but formidable duo, forever linked by the extraordinary battle they had won. The town of Willow Creek, forever changed by the events, began to heal. The public trust in local governance, once eroded, began to be slowly rebuilt. New, ethical leaders emerged, committed to transparency and community welfare. The shadow of Arthur Harrison's influence was gone, replaced by a renewed sense of hope and collective empowerment. As for Arthur Harrison, his sentencing was swift and severe. He received a lengthy prison term, a testament to the gravity of his crimes and the undeniable evidence against him. His appeals were summarily rejected. The man who had once commanded an empire now faced the stark reality of confinement, stripped of his wealth, his power, and his freedom. It was a fitting end for a man who believed himself above all consequences. Justice, delayed but not denied, had been served. With Arthur Harrison's conviction and imprisonment, a palpable wave of fresh air swept through Willow Creek. The heavy shadow that had loomed over the town for years lifted, replaced by a renewed sense of community and empowerment. For Alara, the immediate aftermath of the trial brought a strange mix of profound peace and exhilarating new possibilities. The quiet life she had once known was irrevocably altered, but the path ahead, though uncertain, was filled with purpose. Buster, completely recovered from his injuries, was now Willow Creek's unofficial mascot. His daily walks with Alara through the now safe park were met with warm smiles, friendly greetings, and often an offering of a treat or a gentle pat from grateful residents. He basked in the attention, his tail a perpetual blur of happiness, a living, breathing symbol of the justice that had been won. His small scar, once a painful reminder of cruelty, was now a badge of honor, a silent testament to the fight they had endured. Alara found herself navigating a new reality. The torrent of media attention gradually subsided, but the recognition lingered. She was no longer simply the librarian, she was Alara Vance, the woman who stood up to Harrison. This newfound visibility came with unexpected opportunities. Animal welfare organizations, impressed by her quiet courage and meticulous investigative skills, reached out with job offers. Local community groups, eager to continue the momentum of civic engagement, invited her to join their boards and initiatives. One particular offer resonated deeply with Alara. Pets and People United, a newly formed nonprofit dedicated to advocating for animal welfare and protecting vulnerable communities from corporate overreach, offered her a position as their community outreach coordinator. The role perfectly blended her newfound passion for justice with her inherent desire to help others. It involved educating residents about their rights, assisting communities facing similar development threats, and working with local authorities to implement stricter regulations against unethical practices. After much deliberation and several long conversations with Mrs. Albright, Ilara decided to take the leap. It was a daunting step, leaving the comforting familiarity of the library, but it felt right. She still volunteered at the library a few hours a week, maintaining her connection to the quiet world that had shaped her. But her primary focus shifted to her new role. "You're a natural, Ilara," Mrs. Albright told her after Ilara's first community meeting, where she had spoken with a quiet conviction that captivated the audience. "You connect with people. You make them feel heard. That's a rare gift." Their friendship, forged in the crucible of adversity, became a cornerstone of Ilara's new life. Mrs. Albright, invigorated by their success, became a key advisor for Pets and People United, lending her journalistic expertise to their research and public relations efforts. She became a mentor to Ilara, not just in professional matters, but in navigating the complexities of public life and managing the emotional demands of advocacy work. They often spent evenings at Ilara's apartment, with Buster curled at their feet, planning strategies, reviewing cases, and sharing stories, their bond deepening with every shared triumph and challenge. Ilara's work brought her into contact with countless individuals and communities who had suffered similar injustices. She met elderly couples facing eviction, small business owners threatened by aggressive developers, and activists fighting to protect local green spaces. Each story rekindled her initial indignation, reminding her that the fight against unchecked power was ongoing. She channeled her past fear and anger into a calm, resolute determination to make a difference. Her approach was always empathetic and data-driven, a unique combination of her gentle nature and her acquired investigative skills. She taught communities how to research public records, how to document threats, and how to organize effectively. She helped them navigate the often confusing legal landscape, connecting them with pro bono lawyers and legal aid services. She became a beacon of hope for those who felt powerless. The transformation in Ilara was subtle but profound. The timid, often overlooked woman had blossomed into a confident, compassionate leader. Her voice, once barely a whisper, now carried weight. She still valued her quiet moments with Buster, her walks in the park, but she no longer shied away from the spotlight when it meant advocating for justice. She had found her purpose, not in grand gestures, but in the painstaking work of empowering others and holding the powerful accountable. Blake Harrison, meanwhile, continued his mandatory community service at the animal shelter. The initial resentment in his eyes slowly began to give way to something else. Days spent cleaning kennels, feeding rescued animals, and witnessing the selfless dedication of the shelter staff chipped away at his ingrained sense of entitlement. He saw firsthand the consequences of neglect and cruelty, and slowly, incrementally, a seed of empathy began to sprout in his hardened heart. He still had a long way to go, but the forced exposure to kindness and vulnerability was beginning to effect a change no one, least of all himself, would have expected. His public humiliation was a harsh teacher, but perhaps, in time, a necessary one. The physical landscape of Willow Creek also reflected the changes. The bulldozers meant for the Gateway Project remained idle. Instead, local initiatives began to flourish. Community gardens were expanded, public spaces revitalized, and a new town council, committed to transparency, was elected. The elderly homes that Arthur Harrison had tried to seize were now cherished symbols of resilience, their owners finally living in peace. The park, the site of Buster's attack, was officially renamed Buster's Community Park. A small, tasteful plaque was installed near the old oak tree where the incident occurred, depicting Buster's joyful silhouette and a simple inscription for Buster and the courage he inspired. It was a subtle, yet powerful, tribute, ensuring that the story of quiet bravery and the triumph of justice would not be forgotten. Alara would often visit the plaque, sometimes alone, sometimes with Buster trotting proudly beside her. She would touch the smooth bronze, remembering the fear, the anger, and the burning resolve that had changed her life forever. She looked at Buster, healthy and happy, chasing squirrels with renewed vigor, and knew that every struggle, every moment of doubt, had been worth it. Her life was no longer defined by what she lacked, but by the profound connections she had made, the injustices she had helped right, and the unexpected strength she had discovered within herself. She was a testament to the idea that true power doesn't come from wealth or influence, but from integrity, compassion, and the courage to stand up for what is right, even when no one expects you to. The years that followed Arthur Harrison's downfall saw a remarkable transformation in Willow Creek, a testament to the ripple effect of one courageous act. The Willow Creek Gateway Project, once a symbol of unchecked greed, became a permanent reminder of the community's resilience. The land was not sold off, but revitalized. With the collaborative efforts of Pets and People United, the Citizens for Willow Creek, and the newly elected Ethical Town Council, a significant portion of the acquired land was transformed into a sprawling community hub. It featured new public gardens, safe walking trails that connected to Buster's Community Park, and even a small, open-air amphitheater for local events. Alara, now firmly established as the Community Outreach Coordinator for Pets and People United, found her life profoundly fulfilling. Her work took her to various towns, sharing Willow Creek's success story and empowering other communities to fight similar battles against corporate encroachment and political corruption. She taught them how to access public records, how to organize grassroots movements, and how to effectively present their cases to local authorities and the media. Her gentle demeanor, combined with her meticulous approach, made her an incredibly effective advocate. Buster, of course, was always by her side, whenever possible. He became an unofficial therapy dog for the communities Alara visited, his calm and affectionate nature a source of comfort to those who were themselves battling fear and intimidation. His story, told countless times, became a powerful parable, the small, defenseless creature whose suffering ignited a revolution. The scar on his side, once a mark of pain, was now celebrated as a symbol of endurance and the triumph of good over evil. The transformation in Blake Harrison was perhaps the most unexpected, and for Alara, a quiet source of profound satisfaction. His mandatory community service at the animal shelter stretched into voluntary work long after his probation ended. The initial resentment slowly, almost imperceptibly, melted away, replaced by a genuine connection with the animals he cared for. He learned empathy, a virtue completely absent from his privileged upbringing. He started working full-time at the shelter, dedicating himself to the welfare of the very creatures he had once so casually harmed. One day, years after the trial, Alara found Blake kneeling in a kennel, gently comforting a terrified, newly rescued dog. He looked up, and for the first time, their eyes met without anger or fear, but with a shared understanding. "Alara," he said, his voice softer, less arrogant than she had ever heard it. I I just wanted to say I'm truly sorry for what I did to Buster, for everything. He didn't deserve it. You didn't deserve it. None of it. Alara simply nodded, a small, genuine smile on her face. Thank you, Blake, she replied. She saw genuine remorse in his eyes, a stark contrast to the sneering boy who had kicked Buster. It was a testament to the long, arduous road to redemption, a journey she had, inadvertently, set him on. Arthur Harrison remained imprisoned, his appeals exhausted. His vast wealth had dwindled, consumed by legal fees and forfeited assets. The man who had once dominated Willow Creek was now just a forgotten name in the annals of its history, a cautionary tale whispered to new generations about the perils of greed and unchecked power. His legacy was not the grand gateway project he had envisioned, but a community united against his corruption, a park named after a rescued dog, and the vibrant life of a woman he had tried to silence. Mrs. Albright continued to be Alara's closest confidant and intellectual partner. Their shared victory had forged an unbreakable bond, a partnership based on mutual respect and a shared commitment to justice. They would often sit in Buster's community park, watching children play near the plaque, reminiscing about the journey they had taken. Who would have thought? Alara, Mrs. Albright would often say, her eyes twinkling, that a quiet librarian and a scruffy dog could bring down an empire. Alara would just smile, looking at Buster, who was usually chasing a ball or rolling in the grass, utterly content. Sometimes, she would reply, the quiet ones have the loudest truths to tell. The story of Alara and Buster became a local legend, passed down through families, a source of pride and inspiration. It reminded everyone that heroism wasn't always about grand, dramatic acts, but often about the quiet courage to stand up for what is right, even when the odds seem insurmountable. It was a story of resilience, of unexpected alliances, and of the enduring power of empathy and justice. Alara, once defined by her quietness, had found her voice and her purpose. She continued to live her life with integrity and compassion, but now with a newfound confidence that radiated from within. She was no longer afraid to be seen, to be heard, to lead. She proved that even the most unassuming person, when pushed to their limits by injustice, can unleash a strength that can change lives, change communities, and leave a lasting legacy of hope and triumph. And it all started with a simple act of profound cruelty and a loyal dog who needed someone to fight for him.